You're listening to Guardians of Galen, your go-to podcast for USC Trojan basketball.
Let's get started.
Welcome to Guardians of Galen, the podcast centered around USC basketball. I'm your host, Casey Kasliner, here on this Saturday, where the Trojans lost to the number 24th ranked team in the nation, the Wisconsin Badgers, 84-69. Here on episode 1, we'll take a look at everything that went down in this game and individual performances, as the Trojans just really couldn't establish themselves early on and had a 15-point deficit at halftime. Of course, end up losing by 15 points, but if you watch this game, you would know that the Trojans made things interesting really at the beginning of that second half and into the latter stages of it, but Wisconsin knew what to do to close out this game and win by a significant margin. The Badgers look like a wagon right now out of the Big Ten. They've won 7 straight games, look really, really dominant. And of course, the Trojans come in with back-to-back victories, some good ones over Big Ten foes, Illinois and Iowa. Of course, the Illinois game was USC's first road-ranked win in 15 years. They take down Iowa. It looks like, at that point, it looks like USC had sort of established a true identity of, you're going to feed Desmond Claude inside. He really has that ability to run isolations, run a lot of different things. It doesn't have the three-point stroke that you maybe want out of a first option. Then you add in the versatility of St. Thomas, Wesley Yates, and others, and it really seemed like USC was establishing an identity. And of course, one loss against Wisconsin and, one loss out of the past few where USC's look good isn't a deal breaker on the season or really any momentum they have. But of course, losing by 15 on your own home court is never a good feeling. Now, before we get into the rest of the game, I want to look at some of the positives for USC because there's a lot of negative you can say when you lose by 15 points. Of course, USC, made this game interesting, and that's the one positive in particular I want to take a look at. The Trojans were on a 13-0 run in the second half, and taking a look at Desmond Claude, he had a big goose egg on the stat sheet in the first half with 0 points. He really didn't look like himself. He was 0 of 3 from the field. Played all but 5 minutes of that first half. Then in the second half, he has 9 points. And look, 9 points for Desmond Claude is nothing special. Of course, we've seen him in recent games really go off, especially in second halves. Against Illinois, he had 31 points. 21 of those were in the second half. And then, of course, Iowa, he had 25 points and really thrived at the charity stripe with 10 free throws. And really a lot of that was coming with him driving inside. And it felt like today the Trojans struggled with, getting to the line and, kind of taking advantage of those points that were kind of freebies. But Desmond Claude was pretty pivotal in that comeback bid for USC at the beginning of the second half. Of course, they didn't complete the comeback and ultimately lose this game, but he had 9 points, and I'm not going to say that this was a good game for Desmond Claude overall with just 9 points, but at the end of the day, for him, he helped them get back in this game. And so that's one positive in particular. It's their fight. The Trojans were able to handle Wisconsin's wrath and really come back in this game, make it interesting before Wisconsin ultimately took the momentum back and go and win this game. The other main positive I want to take a look at is the Trojans' ability to contain John Tonge, who, for the record, is an 18-point-per-game scorer. He was held to 0 points in this game, only took 3 shots, 2 of which from beyond the arc. He missed all of them, played in 22 minutes. So, of course, head coach Greg Gard really probably was disappointed with his play in this game, but it didn't matter because a lot of players in this game for Wisconsin shine. They had 4 players in double figures. Max Klesmit, who, of course, recently coming off an injury, is back, was 7 of 14 from the field, makes 18 points for the Badgers. Nolan Winter has 13 points in this one, 6 of 7. So a very efficient game overall. The Badgers shot over 56%. And overall, a dominant win. They also won the three-point battle in this game, had 9 threes, and the Trojans only had 6. And that's been a weaker spot for Eric Musselman's team this year. The Badgers also thrived off turnovers. They had 22 points off turnovers to USC's 13. And also had more assists than USC by 4, and really shot better at the free throw line as well. USC did not shoot well at the free throw line, was 11 of 17. And of course, those 6 points that they didn't get ultimately aren't probably the difference between winning and losing. But, in games like this where it was close at certain moments, it's always disappointing to kind of lose that momentum when it's there. So let's take a look at individual performances for USC. So for back-to-back games, the star is St. Thomas, undeniably. We saw last game he was near a triple-double with 9 of 10, 90% shooting from the field, plenty of good moments for him against Iowa, and he carried that into Wisconsin, plays all 40 minutes, 7 of 11 from the field, so slightly less efficient, but he's 2 of 3 from beyond the arc, 19 points, like I said, 2 steals, 3 assists. Not much more you can ask for from a guy like St. Thomas. He's 6'7". He's not, their typical three-point shooter. And we'll talk about Chibuzo Abo in a minute, the guy who they usually rely on for three-pointers. But St. Thomas in this game really did what he was asked of. He plays every minute of this game. And he is, one of a few bright spots for USC. Of course, I'll say it again. It's a 15-point loss. There's not much you can really celebrate. But St. Thomas really emerging into a star. Not to say he wasn't earlier in the season, but is finding the consistency, it appears, in these past few games, and that's what they need out of a guy like that. So we mentioned Desmond Claude, but 9 points, really not a great game for him, especially considering the 5 turnovers. We'll move on to Chibuzo Abo, who, of course, is the Trojans' most effective three-point shooter this season. Of course, he plays on a team that really isn't that great at three-point shooting, but he has been their most reliable three-point shooter, at least of the players that gets minutes. Consistently, he's, sits around 40%, but really didn't have much going from beyond the arc today. Only with 7 points. He was 1 of 5 from 3, 3 of 11 from the field, had 2 personal fouls, 9 rebounds though. And, that's a big thing as well because USC is the most out-rebounded team in the Big Ten. And a lot of that comes with Josh Cohen just really not being a great rebounder for his size. And I think, fans can tell that Rashawn Agee is basically the starting center for this team. He does come off the bench, but he plays way more minutes. And so Josh Cohen only plays 4 minutes in this game, took 1 shot and missed, had 2 turnovers, and obviously Eric Musselman likes to use him in certain moments, but really he did not do much. Rashawn Agee, though, was a bright spot for USC. He had 15 points. He is coming off a 9-point outing against Iowa, had 13 against Illinois. Is really establishing himself as a consistent center or big man on this team. I mean, although he's only 6'8", so, not a true center, but the Trojans are just getting out-rebounded in a lot of these games, and it's been a very hard thing to watch when you see a lot of other teams get second-chance points. Just for context, USC, in terms of rebounds and offensive rebounds, are 324th in the nation in offensive rebounds per game, and 224th in the nation in defensive rebounds per game, and really they only tally 32 per game. So it's a struggle for USC in the paint sometimes in establishing, their ground. And a lot of that comes with Josh Cohen and Rashawn Agee splitting time, and neither of which really having the true tendencies that a center needs inside the lane. Of course, Josh Cohen can get the job done sometimes, but he has just not been a typical center that we've seen, USC have the past couple of years, a lot of big men that can, at least get rebounds. So that was a struggle for USC, and it has been this season. Definitely something to keep your eye on if you're looking at stats. It's when can USC sort of establish that rebounding momentum. But at the end of the day, Wisconsin dominated this game, and, it's encouraging when you see a comeback, but the Trojans at least can say another positive is they were only out-rebounded by 2, and so, it was generally more even in that category. So we took a look at some individual performances. We'll finally take a look at Wesley Yates, who has been a very big bright spot for USC this season. Of course, his first year in playing college basketball was at Washington last year, didn't see the court at all, and had 11 points, pretty efficient game overall. He was 5 of 9 from the field, but, his three-point stroke was really the difference maker against Iowa. He was 4 of 5 in what was his career high in points, 21 for him on Tuesday, and just didn't really have much against Wisconsin. Not a bad game for him per se. Of course, there was other players that got time in this game, Harrison Hornery, Kevin Patton, but the main players just really didn't show what they've been showing except for St. Thomas. And, to think that USC only lost by 15 is honestly pretty remarkable considering that discrepancy. And so that's one thing to think about. So for USC, of course, they lose this game and they have UCLA lingering. But one thing that was interesting I want to talk about is Eric Musselman in the press conference basically said that the Trojans have no home court advantage. And I think that's a pretty bold thing to say if you're the head coach of a team, especially in your first year at the program. But I mean, I was at the game and I can sort of agree with them. I feel like, you enter the Big Ten, it's a conference that's known for the dedication to the teams. And not that USC doesn't have fans, they most certainly do. But of course, it feels like sometimes they don't really thrive off of that home energy. And so that's one thing to think about. I don't want to harp on it too much because it's, sort of an intangible thing. It doesn't have to do with the game that much, but it is notable. USC, of course, is a big sports university, just didn't really have, what it took in this game. And, you can blame the fan turnout, you can blame a lot of different things, but they were just outclassed in this game. But yeah, limiting John Tonge to 0-3 from the field is certainly a big factor in why this game was as close as it was at certain times. But of course, for Wisconsin, a great starting lineup. Their bench also provided some help. USC's bench is short. Terrence Williams is injured, has really no foreseeable return time, it seems like. And so Rashawn Agee is kind of that sixth man for them. And like I mentioned earlier, basically a starter. And so, yeah, a couple notes I took from this game is the Trojans, like I said, their defense, I mentioned this a little earlier, wasn't bad out the gate. They come out with a drop defense, really defending well, kind of on the perimeter. And Chibuzo, Abo, and Claude just seemed off from the get-go. And I mentioned Claude's ability to sort of help them on that run, but they just seemed off from the get-go. St. Thomas really stood out, but the momentum was just not in their favor. And I think really for USC, to win games, they're really going to have to lay the hammer down early. And we saw against Indiana, they were able to shut down Umar Ballo early. And of course, he's a great passer. There's more to his game than just making shots and scoring points. Of course, he did erupt in the second half. And, that was a big factor for Indiana in that game. But the point I'm trying to make is USC sometimes has that ability to come out and make a statement. We saw against Oregon, leading at half in that game earlier in the season. And I think for USC going forward, they're just going to have to really come out, not make any mistakes early. And I think it helps when their starting lineup seems like it's gelling a lot more. So those guys are going to have the opportunity to really gel more as the season goes on. I mentioned the UCLA game coming up. The Trojans are actually going to play Nebraska first. Maybe a game that's not as talked about compared to the UCLA one, just because it's a rivalry game and the fans get into it. But they're going to head to Nebraska on Wednesday and take on the Cornhuskers, a team that's 12-5. And really, from my looking at the Cornhuskers, they're a good team. Of course, they have some stars on their roster. Bryce Williams, Juwan Gary is averaging 12 points per game. And there's a few others that, make waves in this lineup. But I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the Trojans can shut down, if they can at all, Bryce Williams. They shut down John Tonge in this game, and he's an 18-point per game scorer, and Bryce Williams is as well. So hopefully that perimeter defense that really looked good against Wisconsin today can stand up and really allow the team to generate turnovers and, go on the fast breaks. Because we know how good the Trojans can be in transition. That's a big part of Eric Musselman's coaching style. It's scoring in transition. And, we saw some of that today. Just it wasn't as consistent as usual. But the biggest thing for me, and I mentioned this when I talked about John Blackwell earlier, the reason why he had 28 points on top of just his ability to do a lot of different things, be versatile and tenacious inside, is he completely took advantage of defensive holes and misassignments inside the arc for USC, and getting to the lane, it just seemed like he was doing it effortlessly. And he had an and one. He had these layups that he went up and under, and he looked to be very dominant. USC, looking ahead again, is ahead of Nebraska in the Big Ten standings because the Trojans have one more conference victory, but Nebraska's 2-4 in the Big Ten. And then, of course, next weekend, the Trojans will take on UCLA, a team that's been struggling as of late. They beat Iowa, but have lost 4 of their last 5 games. Sebastian Mack, has been kind of sometimes their lone star in those losses. And, of course, the Trojans are going to have sort of a chip on their shoulder playing against Trent Perry, who was committed to USC for a long time as a recruit. And then, of course, Kobe Johnson, who was with the team for a few years, and both of which now don blue and gold at UCLA. So for USC, it was certainly a disappointing loss, but when you start the way they did and you can't really get anything rolling right away, especially with, two of your better players in Chibuzo Abo and Desmond Claude not starting well, there's not much you're really able to do. But I give them props for cutting the lead down, the deficit down rather, in the second half. And that was really impressive out the gate, out of the break. And so it really seemed like they were able to put up a fight and, do what they needed to do to make this game interesting. I just think for next game and going forward, Desmond Claude, we've seen this a few times, including the Illinois game. And I don't want to, cheapen his performance because he had 31 in that game, but he only had 10 in the first half and didn't seem like he was maybe going to have the game he was going to have. I want to see him continue to rise up in the second half. And I want the Trojans to continue playing well off the transition. And a lot of that starts with him. He's a versatile guard. He's not the best shooter, but he's a good passer and, of course, good in isolation. And so the USC guards are going to want to continue to do a lot of things. And I want to see Chibuzo Abo, like I mentioned, secondly, another player that struggled, just really not hesitate. It seemed like against Wisconsin, he often would take up that first shot, maybe take an extra dribble, and then lose that wide open space. Claude, I could say the same about him. And so we'll see what happens. But that's just going to about wrap it up here for the first episode of Guardians of Galen, the unofficial podcast of USC basketball. I talk about USC sports all the time on my X account, Casey Casliner, all one word. Make sure to follow my Instagram as well. And same username, Casey Casliner, and this YouTube channel if you enjoyed. USC, of course, takes a loss, but they'll try to get back in the win column against Nebraska and UCLA as we look forward. Wisconsin, man, they look very good. 7 straight wins, 5-2 in the Big Ten, 15-3 overall. They're just going to want some more consistency from John Taj. Of course, he's a great player, but to not score against USC is a little surprising. So we'll see what happens going forward. The Trojans suffer a loss after back-to-back wins and put another L in the loss column. Let me know your thoughts on this game. I will see you guys in the next one, and have a good one.